Travis, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. My name's Travis Dumsday. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Concordia University of Edmonton, which is in Northwest Canada. I've been teaching there for about 10 years. Mostly work in philosophy of science, medical ethics, and philosophy of religion.
Cool. So the topic today was divine hiddenness. Could you tell me, give the audience a general description of what divine hiddenness is and what your position on divine hiddenness is?
Well, it means different things in different contexts, but in contemporary philosophy of religion, what's referred to as the problem of divine hiddenness is basically an argument for atheism. It's an argument that's trying to show that God does not exist. And so as an argument for atheism, it basically works like this, that God in theory is supposed to be this all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing entity that wants what's best for us, right? That loves us. And presumably, especially major religions tend to suggest that what's best for us is having a relationship with God, right? That's sort of our highest end, is to know God and become more like God, at least in character and virtue and things like this. So you'd think if God really existed and really loved us, then he would make himself available to relationship with all of us, right? That he would make himself knowable to all of us, available to all of us. And so you'd think that God would ensure that everyone has access to a rational belief in him, right? That God would ensure that everyone is able to believe in him. Or to put it differently, that God would make sure that no one is an atheist or an agnostic, or at least through no fault of their own finds themselves in a position of unbelief. So if God really exists and really loves us, you would expect that he would make himself known to all of us. He would make himself available for relationship to all of us. And yet we find there are lots and lots of people who, through no fault of their own, don't believe, who through no fault of their own are agnostics or atheists or belong to other non-theistic religions. And so the argument is that, well, this is not the situation we would expect to see if there were really a God. And so this is evidence against the existence of God.
And what is your position on the argument? Do you think it's successful? God doesn't exist?
Depends what you mean by success. I mean, I think it's, as arguments for atheism go, I think it's a good argument. I think it raises some interesting issues. I think it's a powerful argument. It's one that demands a response. I think it's certainly better than some other arguments for atheism that are, have been sort of floating around in the literature for a long time. So yeah, I think it's worthy of attention. I do think there are some reasonable responses to it. I don't think that the argument ultimately should rationally compel anyone towards atheism or agnosticism. But yeah, it's a powerful argument. It's worthy of attention. It's worthy of discussion. Theists should take it seriously.
When you say it shouldn't compel anyone, I imagine that if I was comparing two possible kinds of a God, one who would reveal itself and one who would not, I can see myself preferring the idea that God would reveal himself. And so if God would not, that would be a lesser kind of a God, or a less preferable kind of a God. And so that would be a reason to think it wouldn't be perfect in some sense. And if that's the case, that would eliminate the ideas of God as being a perfect being kind of a thing. Because you could argue that one of the things of requirements of perfection is that there wouldn't be a greater possible being of some kind, and a greater possible being would be one who would in fact converse with everyone. And that could be an argument that it would eliminate any kind of perfect being semantic kind of God. What are your thoughts?
That's a way to go. Yeah, but I guess it depends on how you think of the boundaries of the terms of debate, right? So to use an analogy, think of the problem of evil as another sort of prominent argument for atheism, right? If God is real and all good and all powerful and all knowing, then he must be aware of all the terrible things that are happening in the world. He must be able to stop them. And if he's loving, surely he'd want to stop them. And yet we have all these horrors going on every day around the world continuously. And so this is evidence against the existence of God. Now, one way you could immediately counter that kind of an argument is to say, well, okay, let's just change our view of God, right? God is real and he's perfectly good and he's all knowing, but he's not all powerful. He actually can't stop all the evil that's going on. Maybe even can't stop very much of it, right? Or maybe you want to preserve omnipotence, but you're willing to give up the notion that God is all knowing. So you say, well, God's all good and he's all powerful, but he just doesn't know what's been happening here. And so he's off the hook for permitting evil because he's just unaware of what's been going on. Now you can do that. And in fact, within philosophy of religion, there are moves like this that have been made. Usually they're not quite that bold about completely dropping a divine attribute, but they'll make something like that, right? They'll weaken one of the divine attributes at least to make it less all-encompassing. But usually theists, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Baha'is, people who adopt what's sometimes called classical theism, traditional theism, they usually shy away from those kinds of moves, right? We generally prefer to try to come up with ways of dealing with these arguments while still preserving the traditional view of God, right? Is there a way to accommodate evil in a world in which there really is a God who really is all-knowing, all-powerful, all good? Same thing with hiddenness. Is there a way to accommodate the reality of blameless non-belief while still affirming there's a God who has these traditional attributes that theists want to affirm?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can just say God doesn't care, or maybe God is deistic or pantheistic. It doesn't have a mind of some kind, and that would be an explanation. But I think that the goal of most atheists when presenting this argument is to defeat Christianity or classical theism in some sense. And so, if we can show that it's more reasonable to think that the classical theistic God with all the omnis, could not produce this outcome, then I think it would be a successful argument from the perspective of the atheist. So my argument would be something like, if there's one logically possible world to achieve all of the positives or hypothetical positives of whatever the purpose of this world is, but without him being hidden or without evil, then the fact that he did not choose that world must entail that you have to diminish one of his properties. And he's not all powerful, not all knowing, not all caring, whatever. In which case, um, most theists their conception of a god must be wrong in some sense because they have to diminish one of those properties. And if and that's definitely the route I would want to take with the argument. I would want to say that you have to diminish the idea of a god that Christians have, and in that sense, because most people only believe in one kind of a god, if you diminish it in any sense, they usually stop believing in a god. So why would we? Is there a way to try to justify the argument without diminishing one of the properties of a god?
I think so, yeah. Well, I guess that, since the topic came up, it is worth pointing out that, a lot of this depends on what kind of a religious background, if any, person's approaching this from, right? If you've got like a Taoist or a neo-pagan or a Shintoist or something who's coming into this already being a kind of polytheist, right? There's many divine beings of varying levels of power and influence and authority and goodness.
And
And
they
there
don't
isn't necessarily a single all-powerful, all-good, not a single entity with all these properties.
and they don't even care
There's,
about being whether we know about them or not. They're pretty much ambivalent to whether or not we know of their existence. Most of them. So
yeah, or a lot of them would be, yeah. So I mean, in philosophy of religion, especially sort of the English-speaking philosophy of religion world, I think oftentimes we kind of uh, ignore or poo-poo some of these other sort of potential ways of approaching these debates. But I'm not sure that's fair. I mean, I think there's some interesting work being done by neo-pagan philosophers. There's some interesting work being done by Taoist and Shinto scholars and things. And one of the interesting things about those kinds of positions is precisely the fact that they sidestep some of these problems, right? I mean, no doubt their positions have unique problems of their own, but they do end up not having to deal with some of the things that most philosophers of religion in the West tend to get devote a lot of attention to. Anyway, just one thing to point out. It's one of those things that makes those sort of positions kind of interesting from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, I think that's because the goal of the atheist, the arguments against God, is just targeting whatever the most prevalent definition of God happens to be at the time. And if it changes, then the atheist definitions are probably going to change accordingly.
Yeah, and in our time and place, yeah, certainly the most prevalent notion of the divine is, broadly Judeo-Christian one. Yeah.
So what would be your take on the divine hiddenness problem to try and solve it without changing God's inherent properties?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a single best way of trying to deal with this. My own approach. So I am a Christian. You can probably tell from the icons sort of lurking in the background there.
Yes, the holy smoke detector. I recognize that one.
Yeah. Yeah, so I am a Christian. I think there are ways of addressing these sorts of arguments that allow us to preserve a Christian conception of God. But I don't know if there's a single best way of doing it. My own approach, and I find the problem of hiddenness more interesting than the problem of evil, and that's the one I've focused on in my own work. But I've not really focused on some kind of single specific strategy. So my approach to this has kind of been the machine gun strategy, where I think there's a whole bunch of different ways of trying to deal with this, and I want to explore a bunch of them and see their pros and cons. And so I've got whatever it is, 15 or 20 papers on the subject, all of which are trying to lay out a different, sometimes incompatible strategies of reply to the problem. So I can go through a couple of those, and you can just get a sense of some of the ideas I've been playing around with over the years. For example, one paper was called Divine Hiddenness as Divine Mercy. And so here I was exploring the idea that maybe God does not make, maybe God refrains from making his existence obvious to everyone at all times, because doing so would put us in an awkward position in terms of our moral culpability, right? If degree of culpability is at all correlated to degree of knowledge, right? The more you know, the more accountable you are, the more responsible you are. Think about a situation in which you know that God is there. You know with no room for rational doubt that God is there. How do you know this? I don't know. You've had some kind of revelation, whether personal or public. There have been dramatic worldwide miracles that have revealed the existence of God or something like this, or you've had a series of powerful mystical experiences that make God's reality indubitable to you.
You can like see Jesus. He's just sitting there, like looking at you. It's just like, yeah, I can. Hey, how's it going? Just waves.
Yeah, and somehow you've got overwhelming evidence that you're not schizophrenic, you're not having a breakdown, et cetera, right? So you got incontrovertible evidence that God is real. Is it worse if you go out and rob a liquor store under that epistemic circumstance? Or is it worse if you go out and rob a liquor store under your current epistemic circumstance where all this is open to doubt? In other words, are you going to be more blameworthy? Are you going to be, is it going to be worse if you do this with the open, unambiguous knowledge there's this perfectly good entity who's there and has certain expectations of you?
I don't know, because I don't see a difference there. Like, to me, it's immoral whether or not someone knows you do it or not. And so the blameworthiness wouldn't change fundamentally whether or not you know you were on camera. Essentially, I don't know how to process that. I mean, if your argument was something like you would be less likely to do it because there's clearly someone there watching, that would make sense. But I don't know if the blameworthiness would change.
I don't know. Wouldn't there be something a little extra bad about open defiance to this perfectly good being that you're constantly aware of in an indubitable way? You're sort of openly flouting his goodness and authority by doing bad stuff right there in his face.
I don't know, because I don't see that as immorality or an immoral action itself. To do an immoral action in front of someone else doesn't itself seem to be immoral. I don't think the location changes the morality of the action in any way. So I don't think so. I mean, why would it?
Well, if you have extra duties, so I mean, if you owe your existence and everything you have to this entity, and you know this entity has certain expectations of you, for your own sake and for the sake of just justice, morality, and you openly defy this being to his face, despite everything he's done for you, keeping you in existence moment by moment, for example. Isn't there something extra bad about that when you know what you're doing?
Part of me says no. Part of me thinks the opposite. So, like, suppose you are trying to betray this god and lie about it because you're trying to hide it from him. I think that would be more bad than just being honest. Be like, yeah, I don't care about your rules. I'm going to steal the alcohol. Um, to me, it seems like the opposite. I intuitively think would be more bad. Like you're trying to do the evil thing, steal the alcohol, but also trying to lie about it to the being. And so in a way, the ambiguity seems to add that extra feature of an additional immoral action or potential additional immoral action of the lying, whereas the flagrant disregard for authority, I don't see that as in and of itself immoral, and I don't see it as substantially different whether it's flagrant regard in front of the person, because either way you're still disregarding the commands of the being. One, you just simply don't know for certain that it's there, but we're assuming in both cases you still have some kind of moral intuition, and so you still think it's wrong to some degree, in which case I don't see how doing it directly in front of the being is wrong, other than the fact you're disrespecting its authority. Obviously, it's watching, so you're disrespecting its authority, and so the disrespecting of the authority would, in and of itself, need to be immoral in some way for that to hold, I think.
Yeah, it would have to be immoral over and above whatever you're doing, right? Plus, it's not just disrespecting an authority; it's disrespecting an unambiguously legitimate authority, right? Because we're thinking about a situation where, like, this is God, and this entity is perfectly good, and that his commandments are perfectly just, etc. And you're doing this despite, or to spite this entity, maybe. I don't know. I suppose you could bring in additional issues involving motivation.
Well, let's say that if we compare one where there's the God who's perfectly moral and has commands and he's right in front of you, versus some kind of a universal law like the Buddhist Brahmin or whatever. And so there's no consciousness watching you, but it's just some kind of moral law that you're violating. Is there a substantive difference between those two?
I think if you're violating a rule that you are certain is a just rule, I think that's worse than violating a rule you're not sure about.
Oh, and that part I would agree. So that part I would agree with, in that if you don't know it's wrong and you're doing it and you don't know if it's wrong or not, then yeah, clearly you can't be as held as culpable as if you know for a certain it's wrong. But if we take the conscious being aspect of it, does the fact that somebody's watching you while you're doing the action, that doesn't seem to make a difference. So like if you compare two possibilities, one is where you know something is wrong and you do it while someone's watching. Whether or not someone's watching doesn't seem to make a difference. But if you're doing something that you don't know if it's wrong, again, whether or not someone's watching doesn't seem to make a difference. And so the crucial fact there seems to be, do you know it's wrong? Whether do you not know it's wrong? And I can understand that being a significant difference. But I don't see how that would tie into the argument.
Oh. I guess people have different intuitions about this. You know, my thought was sort of that if you're personally offending someone by doing something kind of right in front of them, when the person's a legitimate authority, that's kind of worse than if you're, you know, it's an interesting position too, because of course in the case of God, you know, there's no option for doing it behind his back, right? If God's not hidden and you know he's there, there's no option for trying to lie to him or hide stuff. So anything you do is ipso facto going to be, you know, directly kind of in your face.
That's where you'd have to take in the you don't know kind of a thing. So if you're not certain he's there, then you can try to steal the liquor behind his back because you're not certain he's there. Maybe he's not watching. I can try to hide this from him, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's another traditional approach to the hiddenness problem that takes an opposite position here, right? So my thought in this particular paper was, well, if we knew God was there, we were perfectly aware of his presence, we'd still do terrible things. It's just we do terrible things in the open awareness of God's presence. And that would be even worse, right? Because then we'd be committing extra sin and we'd make ourselves liable thereby to extra punishment. God wants to spare us from that kind of extra liability, so he remains hidden. There's another completely opposite, incompatible approach to this, where you say, if God weren't hidden, if we knew he was there, beyond any rational doubt, that would actually conflict with our free will, right? We'd be too afraid of this all-powerful entity constantly watching us, then we would never sin. But the reason we would never sin would be this fear of punishment or this awareness of this being, and so we wouldn't be able to exercise real autonomy. And so God remains hidden in order to preserve our freedom. So that would be an incompatible, opposite way of looking at this that's historically has gotten a lot more attention. And so one of the reasons I wanted to explore this divine hiddenness, divine mercy, you know, is it better for us not to know kind of thing, was as just a sort of reverse take on a more common strategy of dealing with hiddenness, right? The God remains hidden in order to preserve our freedom. It seems to me both these replies can't be right, as they're dealing with different takes on the robustness of human freedom, right? Could we actually retain real efficacious freedom in with the constant awareness of this all-powerful, perfectly good judge watching us all the time? My reply supposes that, yeah, we could still keep sinning, and that'd be really bad for us. The other response suggests, no, we couldn't. We'd lose our freedom, and so that's why God remains hidden.
Yeah, in the second case, I was always confused by that because clearly, I mean, Lucifer knows God's all powerful, right? Except he turns away. The demons know it; they just turn away. So it seems clearly like it's possible to know God is there and to still refuse to obey him. That seems like a thing a large portion of the angels do on a regular basis. So I don't see why it would infringe on our free will. But in both cases, for both versions of the argument, I think a way to address it would be to say, is there a way to achieve the positive, the free will thingy, or the lesserment of culpability without needing to hide God? So can we achieve the good thing of God's being there and us knowing he's there without having the consequence of extra culpability or losing free will? And I think in both cases, the answer is yes. It seems like in the case we can know God's there, but God could just simply get rid of the punishment hypothetically, and if he could, then we wouldn't care if he's there. It makes no difference. If he's not going to do anything, then we wouldn't care. Secondly, if you get rid of the extra punishment aspect in your first example of saying that if you do something wrong directly in front of him, that's an extra sin, we could just not count that as an extra sin, and then it doesn't matter anymore. Then it wouldn't make a difference to anybody if he's right there or not. And so it seems like in both cases you can achieve the desired property of God being there without having the negative consequence of either losing free will or having an extra culpability thing. And so it seems strange or logically impossible that God would choose to include both of those when there is a better world that has the positive but less negatives, given the definition of God being morally perfect or whatever. So if God's morally perfect, he wants a perfect world. And so if there's an extra gratuitous negative side effect that we don't need, including that would be in violation with the perfectly good side of him. And so I think that because there's a logically possible world to attain the positive aspect of God not being hidden without the negative aspects, that those arguments don't seem to hold given the definition of God.
Yeah, well, this also gets back to, how much can we muck around with the divine attributes, right? Because most classical theists would be reluctant to give up the notion of divine justice. So we'd have to sort of nuance that, right? That, maybe God has certain obligations to uphold justice, but that there are ways around it. That's what Christianity says, right? There are ways God tries to mitigate the obligations of justice.
Which part would justice be in reference to from a previous argument?
Well, if you suggested that God can just drop the obligation to punish sin. That's something that classical theists would be reluctant to admit, I think.
Right. So I would argue that I don't think there's a necessary correlation between doing it in front of him and that being a sin. I don't think that's entailed anywhere in the Bible or anything. So I don't think it's necessary for God to view that as a sin. It seems like it could be, it's possible, but I don't think it's necessary. And so I wouldn't say that there's some kind of a logical contradiction between that and divine justice. It doesn't seem like it's an entailment of justice that God must view doing things in front of him as a greater sin.
I don't know. I mean, morally speaking, it might just be a greater sin. And so, I mean, there might just be some moral facts here that are just true objectively, that, it's not a matter of God deciding whether or not to count something as unjust. It's just simply is unjust, and God has to decide how to deal with it. I guess, well, that also brings up questions about how morality relates to God and to what degree moral rules are independent of the divine will and things like that.
Well, to me, that one just seems like there isn't any strong or proof that doing it in front of him is an entailment of morality. It's hypothetical. It's possible that that's the case, but it seems also possible that it's not the case. And so, since let's assume God is a perfect being, he wants to achieve the best possible world, he'd pick the one that would be, instead of just being hidden, he'd just pick to choose the world where being hidden wouldn't make a difference or add an extra obligation. And so there'd be no reason to be hidden in the first place. And so I don't, why would he choose hiddenness rather than just choosing the one where being hidden makes no difference to morality, if both are logically possible worlds?
Well, I'm not sure there would be a logically possible. Again, it depends how morality works as a matter of sort of necessary fact, I think. But plus, too, remember the dialectical sort of situation we're in, right? The atheist has put forward an argument against the existence of God, this problem of divine hiddenness, and the theist puts forward this reply. And perhaps part of one of these replies, this divine mercy reply, relies on certain notions about certain hypothetical ideas about morality, right? That maybe committing certain sorts of sins in the open, flagrant violation of legitimate authority are worse than the mere commission of such sins, and that demands some kind of additional culpability. I mean, if you admit that might be how morality works, if that's not completely implausible, isn't that sort of enough for the theist to say, okay, since this is purely a defensive point, all I need is possibility. If we're going for a defense rather than a theodicy to work in some of the technical language. In other words, if I'm saying maybe that this could be a reason why God remains hidden, I'm not claiming that it is the reason. Isn't that enough?
I don't think so, because I think that if your reason that he remains hidden would itself be an imperfection, then that would contradict the nature of the God in the first place. So if I can show that there's a logically better way to do it, and he chose not to do it, then that itself would be an imperfection, and it would violate his nature, or is that the definition of his nature? And so simply saying that this happens to be the way it is, without comparing it to a better way that it could be, seems to be a naturalistic fallacy of some kind. So, like, is it the best way that it could be that morality would entail a greater punishment for doing it in the face of somebody? I would say no. It doesn't. I don't think so. I don't think, like, if you steal something in front of a cop, you don't get like extra punishment, or you don't get extra time for that. It's not like the doing it in front of an authority or do it in front of a judge or whatever doesn't seem to make a moral difference one way or the other. And so adding that in as a criterion, while it could hypothetically work as like an ad hoc solution to the problem of divine hiddenness, that would it be a better way the world could be, or would it be something that makes the God essentially worse because it's trying to add in like an ad hoc solution rather than just solving the problem in the first place? And so it seems like if we accepted that as a solution, then God made a mistake because he just didn't make the world in the best way he could have made it in the first place.
Yeah, the suggestion though is that God might just have no control over which sorts of actions are more or less bad than other sorts of actions. So if it were the case, if it's not completely implausible that certain kinds of immoral actions are worse when done sort of in open defiance of some kind of relationship. I keep using this language of legitimate authority and using these governmental analogies, but maybe it's more perspicuous if we think about analogies from personal life rather than sort of governmental authority or judicial analogies. So think, for instance, of someone who cheats on his spouse, right? This is terrible. It's really bad if you do this behind her back. But wouldn't there be something a little bit extra worse about, having sex with some other woman and forcing your wife to watch, right? Sort of doing this openly in open breach of the relationship.
Well, I think that would add in an extra feature. So forcing her to watch in and of itself would be bad. Like literally just trapping someone. Like if you could trap God and force him to do anything, I think that in and of itself would be immoral. But say you did it in such a way that you were, she knew about it, not forcing her to watch, because I think forcing her to watch would in and of itself be an immoral action, regardless of what you were forcing her to do. Force her to like watch Teletubbies or something. I consider that to be immoral. But I still would come back to the intuition that doing it without lying would be less bad than doing it and trying to lie about it. It seems like the lie aspect, if there is a moral criterion, would make it worse than being honest about it. It's like, yep, I'm cheating on you. I'm just completely honest about it. Here's a video if you want to watch. That seems to be less bad, I think. But I wanted to go back to what you said about God not being able to change morality, because that seems like it would be an infringement on his all-powerful nature, his omnipotence. And that does seem to, in a way, change his fundamental nature to make it not all-powerful.
Well, I'm a Platonist about morality. I think these rules are just there. God's aware of them. God enforces them. But God didn't create them. God can't change them.
Okay, that's an interesting view.
And there is a debate within, Christian philosophy about whether that does infringe on divine sovereignty or things like this. But I would just argue that it doesn't. I think the traditional Christian view has always been that, at least for central moral rules, they're kind of like the rules of mathematics. They're just there eternally and necessarily.
Yeah, because I think that conception of a God definitely wouldn't warrant the same criticism of like it's not all powerful, because a lot of the Christians I debate with say that it's a result of God's nature or something. And so if morality was an independent Platonic object that God was adhering to, just enforcing or something, then yeah, he wouldn't have a choice over it. So that would make sense.
Well, I should clarify. I think there are some complicated background metaphysics here, right? I think these, abstract entities like numbers and moral rules and uninstantiated Platonic forms, etc., etc. I think they're real. I think they're independent of God's will. But there's some complicated metaphysics lying in the background there. I don't think they're wholly independent of God's being. This is something that you get some really in-depth discussions of this in early Neoplatonism, where they're trying to figure out, what is the relationship between Platonic forms and God, especially once the Christian God comes on the philosophical scene. So I think this stuff is actually really complicated, but I think the view that some Christian philosophers today take, namely that a kind of really robust divine command theory, right? God decides what's right and wrong, and he lays down these commands, and he can change them if he wants to. That's just false. That's not the traditional Christian perspective on morality.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that would fall into the Euthyphro dilemma to say it's subjective. But I guess if you want to grant that there are these things independent of God's choice, he can't just choose to change them, then it would make sense that he must remain hidden if there's some logical contradiction with one of those properties in his nature or something along those lines. But I wouldn't say there is a logical contradiction with saying that things could be different. So if you want to say there is this morality, it has this one particular nature to it, and it would be in conflict with God to change that, well, it could be different. And if it could be different, and the way it could be different would lead to a better world overall, then it seems like the world we're in isn't the best way the world could be. And so there's something wrong with the moral law. If the moral Platonic object being that way, seems like there's something wrong with it. And so I would argue that in the same sense that would lead to a contradiction with God's moral perfection, it would lead to a contradiction with the moral perfection of the Platonic object in that way. So it can't be moral if there's a contradiction with it not leading to the most moral principles. So if there's a more moral set of principles that aren't instantiated by this divine object, well, then it can't be the morally perfect object. It would be like if it said the moral object said drowning babies is moral or something, then we just say that doesn't make sense as the moral object, right? You just say that it can't just be anything. Would you agree with that? Like that there has to be the moral Platonic object has to correspond to the most moral things. It can't just be anything like drown babies is okay.
Yeah, I think there might be a disconnect here in how we're using the language. I guess the way the Platonist is thinking about morality is not mutable or changeable or anything. It's just there, and moral rules and rules of value, rankings of value, are just there. What's genuinely objectively valuable and what's less valuable, etc. Those standards are kind of just there. And God is the most valuable being. God's that than which nothing greater can be conceived. I think Christians are all on board with that. Greatest possible being. And yeah, so the nature of God being the most valuable conceivable entity, there's a way in which that has to line up with whatever the objective value ranking scale turns out to be. So there can't be a conflict between facts about God and God's value. and what God values, and the sort of objective ranking of how morality works, what the moral rules really are, what the ranking of values really are. So I think all this stuff has to line up ultimately.
Oh, right.
But I don't think it's mutable. I don't think morality can change, or these scales of value can alter from from within our world, or if you want to use the modal language, I don't think it can change from one possible world to another. It's just modally fixed. It's necessary.
Right. So I'm not arguing it can change. I'm arguing that it has to be a certain way and can't be other ways. So, for example, if there is a moral Platonic object, the moral Platonic object couldn't have always entailed that drowning babies is good. Like that's not, if there's, or gassing babies is good. Like there has to be
Agreed.
some limitation to what the moral Platonic object can instantiate. It can't just be arbitrarily say whatever.
Absolutely.
And so if it does say something that is in conflict, there's some set of rules here that it must abide by. And if something it says would be in conflict with that set of rules, we can say that's not the moral object. So I'm arguing that having this extra entailment that doing something in front of somebody would be immoral would be kind of like the moral Platonic object saying drowning babies is good. It seems in conflict with the nature of morality from the way I understand it.
Okay, yeah. If your moral intuitions tell you that it is just obviously false that there's anything kind of extra bad about the scenario I've described, if your moral intuitions tell you that just can't be how morality works, yeah, this particular solution to the hiddenness problem has to go out the window. Yeah, you need to trust your conscience, and if what I'm suggesting goes against your moral intuitions, that's a really good reason to distrust my argument.
And if we followed our moral intuitions to, say, the perfect world of some kind, the way I would think the perfect world would be, it'd be like a world where it's impossible to force any being to do anything they don't consent to doing, or something along those lines. And so if a God existed, it would create that kind of a world, essentially. And so from my perspective, anything that doesn't instantiate that definition of morality or something close would be like saying it's okay to drown babies. It's super intuitively wrong. And so if you approach the same thing from divine hiddenness, and we think that there is some perfect instantiation of what the universe would be like, and it isn't that way, is it fair to argue that any kind of justification for why it isn't that way is probably more likely ad hoc than because of some conflict between a Platonic object and God's nature?
Yeah, well, I think now we're moving more into the domain of the problem of evil, which is fine. I mean, there do sometimes tend to be overlaps in how these arguments play out, but between evil and hiddenness. But yeah, that's an interesting example. I'm not sure that could work, right? Could God set up a world in which no one is ever compelled? No one can be compelled to do anything or refrain from. I mean,
Well, so
if you imagine a world where,
so just to clarify, compelled, I wouldn't say. So compelling, I think, is fine. I'd say it's like physically impossible to force anyone to do anything you don't consent to doing. So say I wanted to punch you in the face and I tried, you would essentially turn into a ghost and I just literally couldn't punch you in the face. But it wouldn't affect your conscious states anyway. I wouldn't limit your conscious states or desires in any way.
right, but then wouldn't God have to step in and block certain of your he's going to stop you from doing what you were thinking about doing. And so once you realize you can't do that, you'll never consider doing it again. But that does kind of restrict your field of action, right? If you know that it's impossible for you to do anything that another person doesn't like because God will stop you. It's a very different world than one we live in. And maybe that world would be a better world, but it would be pretty different. Like we really need to sort of explore all the ins and outs and implications of what a thoroughly divinely controlled world would look like and how that would play out.
Well, I wouldn't say it needs to be divinely controlled. Like, obviously, that would be one way to achieve the end, is to literally have God micromanage every physical interaction or something. But he could also just write it in the laws of physics. So, like, I can't fly if I wanted to. I can't just think about flying and fly because physics. And he could essentially make the same thing true of violating people's consent, that there is some extra law of physics he added, and that violating people's consent would be a violation of this law of physics. And so it's just a feature of the universe, just like any other feature of the universe. And so it doesn't need to be micromanaged to be achieved. I don't necessarily see that as a problem, God micromanaging it, other than the fact it would be a lot of work for him, which is intuitively strange for us. But there seems like there's a number of ways to achieve this world, using essentially the same criterion we have in our world, just changing the laws of physics a little bit. And if that's the case, then it doesn't seem like, it seems like the fact that our world isn't that way is gratuitous suffering, gratuitous problems that just don't need to be there.
So you could, for instance, imagine a world in which God set up the laws of physics and anatomy in such a way that any time someone thinks of doing an act that would violate the moral law, they just get violently physically ill until they stop having that thought or desire.
Yeah, that would be a possibility. I'd see that as bad. I
Yeah,
don't think that would be a good way to do it, but yeah,
yeah,
that would
that's
work.
it's the Clockwork Orange scenario that Kubrick,
Yeah.
and whoever wrote the novel came up with. That, yeah, I don't know. That would be a weird world. I mean, maybe that would work, but I don't know. I think that would.
Well, I thought more of like a video game solution where, like, if we're in a digital space and I try to punch you, nothing's going to happen. I'm just going to clip through you, just like walk through you with nothing happening. And the only way to actually make contact would be for you to consent. And then the physical dimensional, I don't know, the quantum fields aligned such that I can interact with your quantum fields or something along those lines. And so, like in a video game, there would be no negative consequences to your body. You wouldn't get sick. You wouldn't be physically stopped. You wouldn't have a mental change. All of your desires could be the same. Um, and so you'd still have the same psychological states and still have the same freedoms. The only difference would be is that you wouldn't be able to impact someone else's freedoms in the same way that we have here.
Are you still allowed? So you've still got free will in a sense. You just can't physically engage with other people. Can you still cause them emotional harm?
Yeah.
Like, can you call them names? And
Yep.
why shouldn't God stop that?
Well, I don't see those as immoral. And so from my perspective, those wouldn't be things that we need to stop. So I'd say it's totally fine. I think that
That's very out of step with the current climate,
the political climate. But yeah, so I would say that the requirement for a perfectly moral world is not being able to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. So if you can say names and they can just mute you, like on Twitter, you can mute the other people you don't like, so you don't have to listen to them, which I think is perfectly fine to have that. But I think it'd be immoral to infringe on their free will to be able to express themselves. I'm a big free speech guy. I think it's moral to have free speech, but it's immoral to force somebody else to listen to your free speech. That part I'm not okay with. So I would say that if my understanding of morality is correct, then the maximum level of freedom to express yourself through your body and your property is perfectly moral, and then infringing that would be immoral. So if God literally stopped you from speaking your mind or made you violently sick when you tried to express your free will, that would be in and of itself an immoral action. So I think the moral thing to do would be to allow you to express yourself, but no one else is obligated to listen in any way.
Yeah, that would be an interesting world. Yeah, we'd have to game that out and try to figure out, what would be. Yeah, a world in which we were physical in some sense, but God intervened or set up the rules in such a way that we could never physically harm
Without consent.
any other entity or be harmed. Without consent.
Because you can still like consent, and euthanasia, totally fine. You could consent to living in a world exactly like this one, in which case everything in this world could happen to you. You just have to consent to being here.
Actually, that's a popular New Age kind of solution to the problem of evil, right? We all chose to be here in a previous life, and so
Yep.
We accepted this world so we can learn certain lessons. And
I did not accept to be here. I refute that argument. But yeah, so I think like given that definition, it seems like a logically possible world that if there was an all-powerful being, he could have created it, and any potential benefit seems like it could be achieved in that world without the consequence. No, like involuntary child cancer. And so if there is involuntary child cancer, then that would show that this isn't the morally perfect world, and there can't be a morally perfect being because he didn't pick the morally superior world where there's only things, consensual things can occur.
Yeah, yeah. The problem of evil is an interesting one. Yeah, there's lots of. Again, I'm inclined to think that these scenarios are more complicated than we initially tend to give them credit for. But yeah, it's if you could come up with a world that I wonder though. So here's a common sort of. You've heard this before, yeah. In such a world, would people long term, I wonder, would they be more vicious or more virtuous than they are in a world like ours? Would such a world promote or hinder the development of certain character traits? Would we be better people long term if we lived in that kind of a world?
I think so, because my intuition is that in video games, we see essentially that kind of a world, or a small percentage of that kind of a world. And what we see is a lot of people helping other people to a far greater extent than in this world. So, like, if I want to beat a boss, there are a lot of people out there who like, let's go do it, play co-op. I'll teach you how to do it. You can find lots of them. There are also a lot of people on the other extreme who are a lot meaner, but it seems the vast majority of people on those spaces are much more cooperatively assistance driven. There's a large communities. The vast majority of the communities seem to be out there to help build and work together. And I think the same thing would occur in this universe, in that we would create artificial limitations like video games, play through Star Wars, and we want to go through with other people and make changes to the way the story is driven and work together to overcome the problems. And even competitively, like we have competitive teams who are friendly with one another and they compete to try and help the dark side versus the Jedis fight against each other to conquer the universe. And it seems like all of that is a cooperative enterprise of groups working together and agreeing on a set of rules that are friendly with one another. And so I think that the vast majority in this world would probably be more virtuous, because of the interactions, or the kinds of interactions that we could have would be parallel to those of video game worlds, where we are interacting in a social space in order to build a world together. Even if it's in a competitive sense, we're doing it in a cooperative manner.
Maybe. I mean, that's an interesting scenario to think about. Although I'm not a gamer, I don't really know. I don't have an experience in that kind of a world, but I do. I mean, I've had female students who've occasionally talked about their experiences in online gaming, and I get the sense it's not all sweetness and light from their perspective.
Yes, if you play the teenage boy games, there's a lot of sexism for sure. But I don't think that. I think that's more about sexual angst rather than the space or the world itself. I think that more of that's biologically driven than anything. So I don't think that would necessarily be a problem in this universe, especially since you could just snap your fingers and make however many sex bots you wanted. So I don't think that would be as much of an issue in this world.
Yeah, but again, if we found a world in which we can snap our fingers for sex bot access, again, I can imagine that if part of God's will for us is not just to avoid suffering and to enjoy ourselves, but to acquire certain kinds of character, a world like that might not be the most conducive to. Again, if we're trying to have a good combination of virtue and happiness, and not just put all the emphasis on happiness, a world like that might be more problematic than we realize at first.
Well, how so? Because I would say that in this world, you could still achieve the same development as a human. So, like in video games, there are very, very difficult video games that you need to learn lots of cooperative skills to be able to beat. Dark Souls, Ninja Gaiden 2 Sigma, one of my favorite games ever. Impossible to beat unless you have two people who are master level at the game. And so you have to work in extreme precision together. Whereas if one person makes a mistake, everything falls apart. And so you have to, and it's very, very stressful. Like learning how to be good at this game takes hundreds and hundreds of hours of practice and stress and losing and getting destroyed and very upset. And I think the same thing would apply to this universe where you can consensually limit your freedoms such that the world is kind of like a very difficult video game. And so you can develop the same character traits as you would in this world, but without having the permanent consequences of losing arms or legs or whatever. And so I think that the character development would be equally as plausible or even greater in this world than in the world we currently live in. Um, and so I don't think that would necessarily hold. The argument that there is not character development to the same degree would probably be untrue because of the expanded possibilities of this world allow for character development, and I think to a greater extent than what we have here. So like given here, to take an extreme example like Hitler or something, Hitler was evil, killed lots of people, died, and it's over. But in this world, he could have his own world where he would gas all of the virtual non-conscious Jews in his universe. And over thousands and thousands of years, he may change his mind. He may introspect about his past and redevelop into a new character. So I think you mentioned the Eastern religions, and I think that they have a very good point that you could potentially achieve enlightenment from going in either direction, the perfectly good or the perfectly bad. And because Buddha started off as perfectly bad, doing all the bad things, and then learned from those experiences and grew. And so in this world where we have these kinds of universes where you can determine your own, the way it should be, I think it gives more opportunity for more people to be able to have character development, and more people would go from the eviler states to gooder states. They tend towards the more virtuous states.
Yeah, again, it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. But my first inclination would still be to think that the kinds of opportunities we're afforded in a world like ours to take care of others and be responsible for others in I think more meaningful ways is still, I mean, I grant there might be certain kinds of character traits we can acquire or improve through the kinds of activities you're talking about, online gaming and analogs of something like that. But I don't think it would be comparable to the kinds of character development we're called upon in everyday kind of, taking care of a kid with cancer, dealing with mentally ill spouse, helping your neighbor manage a divorce, all these kinds of things that we sort of are thrown into in the real world.
Well, why? So we could imagine putting those into a video game scenario. Why do you think those would not be possible to experience in this world?
Stakes are higher in our kind of world. People really depend on us. If you don't take care of your mentally ill wife, she's going to die in the game. There's just, I don't know. Again, I'm not an online gamer. Maybe there are some sources of the analogy that I'm not picking up on, but it doesn't seem to compute to me.
Gotcha. Well, we've been going for about an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Well, unfortunately, most of my stuff is behind paywalls. It's mostly in academic journals where, if you're a university student, you can probably access it through your university library. Otherwise, yeah, if you're interested in what I've written on hiddenness, yeah, you can feel free to send me an email. My name's Travis Dumsday. You can access my institutional email through the Concordia University of Edmonton website. Yeah, I'm not on any kind of social media or anything. So yeah, the institutional emails pretty much the only way to go.
Well,
yeah, it's an interesting conversation. You've got some cool ideas, and I appreciate the chance to talk.
thank you. Appreciate it. Also, in our community, we have ways to bypass paywalls. There's certain sites that let you do that. So unscrupulous sites. But thanks again. Really appreciate you coming on, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.